Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction podcast. This podcast is generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. Welcome to Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction's official podcast. I'm Razia Iqbal, journalist, broadcaster and your host for today. In our second episode to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Baillie Gifford Prize, we're exploring the prize's history and how the world of non-fiction has evolved since its inception. I'll be talking to two of the former chairs of judges, Caroline Sanderson and Andrew Holgate, about what makes the prize special, how they hope to see it change in the future. Andrew Holgate, chair of judges for the prize in 2021, when Patrick Radden Keefe's Empire of Pain was the winner. He was the literary editor of the Sunday Times for more than a decade before recently stepping back, and is an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Caroline Sanderson was the most recent chair of judges when Catherine Rundell's Super Infinite won the 2022 prize. She is also associate editor of The Bookseller, having previewed non-fiction for them for many years, and is the author of 5 non-fiction books herself, including biographies of Jane Austen and the singer Adele. As always, we are immensely grateful to the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its generous sponsorship of this podcast. Thank you both, Caroline and Andrew, for coming on today to talk about the prize and its illustrious past and perhaps what you think it might be like in the future. Now, this is a conversation that I really feel like I'm allowed to contribute to, because this part of it anyway, because it's about what it's like judging the prize. And I was a judge back in 2017 when David France won the prize. And I wonder whether we can start by just talking about the things that really worry us about judging prizes.
Being made to look an idiot about at the end of the whole process. You put a lot of work into it, and then you always worry that you haven't got the right choice, and that there'll be, people will never say to your face, that was a terrible choice. But behind your back, you may have that going on. So there is always that worry. There is always also the worry just of finding the book that really grabs you and you think, yeah, that's going to be it. We read in the course of the process, we read a huge amount of books, and I've always found in almost every prize I've done, there are only ever about 3 or 4 books that really you think, yep, that's it. Whatever prize it is and whatever level, and there is always an anxiety until you begin to find those books.
That is interesting. 3 or 4, 2 or that's incredible.
I always, because it's whatever level the winner sets, you judge everything by that, from that, by that level. So I've been in other prizes where, the judges have said to me, well, God, and you just say, it's natural. That's what happens.
Caroline, what about you? I mean, it's odd for me to start with anxiety, but the reason I do so is that I feel like it is an enormous responsibility, and I'm quite anxious about being decisive about things that I think are the best, because there's so much brilliant writing. And I think that's what informs me. That anxiety is to do with, wow, we're kind of sometimes not even judging like for like.
I understand that anxiety completely, and yes, of course, I felt it. It's a wonderful responsibility, but a responsibility nevertheless. I think I was very lucky last year because we had in Super Infinite by Catherine Rundell a book that every single judge absolutely adored, and the consensus in the final meeting was huge. I mean, we decided in 10 minutes. So I think I was lucky that there wasn't that sense of a real tussle and goodness, which book are we going to go for? And then when we decided, have we chosen the right one? I think I'm quite accustomed to having, all the years that I've been previewing nonfiction for the Bookseller. I suppose it's not quite like Andrew's pages where he's got a number of reviewers contributing and different voices. I'm lucky enough to have this incredible opportunity to highlight nonfiction that I really love. And so I suppose I'm used to this idea that whilst judging is it's a stage by stage process, and that people with different worldviews and experiences are involved, you can get this sort of consensus. And I guess I've grown over the years to be quite comfortable with that idea that the best books sort of rise to the surface. I really do think that they do, and then I see this consensus, um, but also that I suppose I've earned my spurs a little bit, and actually that's what I do. I try and find the best books that I can, and I do feel evangelical about those best books. So although the anxiety is there, it's a massive pleasure. It's a massive pleasure to just cry these books from the rooftops because you love them, because you want other people to know about them.
I totally agree with that. I also, I think, just in terms of anxiety as well, I think what you're always presented with is you're going into a room to sort of display your judgment to, and you're quite vulnerable when you do it, with 5 people or 4 people you don't know. And there is always anticipation and some nerves about what the other judges will be like, and what their worldview will be, and whether it aligns with yours, and if you'll come to an accommodation. Particularly nerve making when you're the chair and hoping that you will all be rowing in the same direction.
We've alluded to it a little in this first answer about anxieties, because the role of literary prizes, of course, is super, super important. Increasingly, there are more and more prizes. I wonder, Caroline, if you will just reflect for us on why they're important, because although there are sometimes books that do get away, and prize juries will overlook some books that go on to do quite well. I'm sure that has happened, or they're shortlisted and they don't win and they do just as well as the winner or something. But I just wonder about the role of prizes in our culture, because there are lots of them, and some people think that they're not particularly valuable. I mean, my view is that they are extraordinarily valuable, not least because there's so much choice, and that they do present us with, if you like, a kind of Premier League that guides us.
Yes, I agree with that. I think they're hugely valuable. I mean, in a way, if you take a step back and you think about the process of judging a prize, it's a slightly crazy exercise, because the books that are chosen are only a function of the people who are judging it. And it sometimes astonishes me that people sort of say, oh, that book should have won, because with a different set of people and on a different day, that book might have won. So it's a very personal thing. Each verdict is a personal verdict in a way, but then it's rooted in that expertise that we've talked about. So it's the nearest you can get to, as it were, the sort of excellence, and that's been tried and tested by people who read a lot. So I think they're hugely valuable, and I know from research that the bookseller's done in the past that these sort of curated, I know some people sort of hate using that word, but I think it's sort of appropriate in this case, these kind of curated selections of what to look out for each month, in my case, are tremendously useful for people, because as we all know, there are many thousands of books published each year, and we have to remember people outside our sort of literary world, people in bookshops are obviously very good at putting, great books on display and drawing people's attention to them. But, just helping people make informed choices. And prizes are brilliant at that. And while you say there are a lot of prizes, I mean, actually, we've lost 2 or 3 quite key prizes over the last year. And so there aren't that many prizes for excellence in nonfiction, and particularly some narrative nonfiction. And so I think that's just given the Baillie Gifford even more of an importance.
And Andrew, you've been, it's arguably a really important gatekeeper, tastemaker for a very long time as the literary editor at the Sunday Times. I mean, I just wonder about in the context of your experience as a literary editor, the value of prizes, and this one in particular.
Hugely valuable. I think what the big elephant in the room here is that it's a declining, or it's a shrinking literary culture, a media literary culture within which we're operating. That there's less space being given to books pages. There's no there's not much in the way of coverage on the television. So I think prizes have a very, very significant role to play. I personally feel that there are possibly too many prizes, that it means that there's a lack of definition. But I think for the Baillie Gifford is an outstanding and had always been an outstanding arbiter of non-fiction and the best in non-fiction. And it is also, interestingly, as just looking down this list, it's also shown over the years changing tastes. It's very accurately reflected those. And so yes, I think overall, literary prizes are hugely valuable to the culture, the literary culture.
I wonder if I can get both of you to think about the year that you were chairs for the prize, and the context I'm really thinking about is British long form narrative non-fiction and American, because in your year, Andrew, an American one, and it was a kind of really important piece of journalism. And in yours, Caroline, it was a young, very young, unbelievably smart British academic who won on a subject that lots of people might argue was hugely obscure for a kind of largely lay audience, John Donne and his life, but actually the most accessible book I've read in such a long time, given the subject matter. Caroline, do you want to go first? The difference between British and American narrative non-fiction?
Gosh, well, I suppose I don't feel so qualified to talk about the American view. Well, I guess what I was thinking when you were talking about that, Razia, was that the best books are there couldn't be anything else, I suppose is what I mean. Because you sometimes read books where, narrative nonfiction books, where you think, actually, this is a sort of stretched long form article. And obviously that long form journalism discipline has been very important and influential. And there are extraordinary books that have come out of it, Empire of Pain being a very notable example. I think that writing a book and writing that kind of long form journalism is still a different discipline. And also writing in an academic way is obviously a different discipline. I think what those winners of the prize that you've mentioned, well, we've mentioned Empire of Pain and Super Infinite, show you is that writing a nonfiction book for a general audience, for you and me, is a very, very different and very accomplished skill. And it's not necessarily given to those who are academics or those who are journalists, however accomplished. It's a different thing again. So whilst those things have been influential, when you listen to Catherine Rundle talking about how long it took her to take what was essentially her academic specialism and turn it into a book for, as you so beautifully put it, this book which is so accessible and just glorious to read. That's a very special talent. And I think that's what I love to see the Baillie Gifford rewarding. Now, obviously, a lot of the winners are underpinned by amazing academic study and long careers in journalism, but we're talking about books. When we're talking about books, we're talking about something else again.
I suppose part of what informed that question, Andrew, was really to do with the kind of long tradition of really quite stellar non-fiction that has come out of America. If you look at, I don't know, Norman Mailer and Gore Vidal and Joan Didion and, people like that. And I suppose I was just thinking, is there a kind of distinctly different kind of writing and place that American and British authors have when it comes to non-fiction?
That's hard, and I'm not sure how much you can generalize. I would say about Patrick Radden Keith's 2021 book, Empire of Pain, that began as a piece of long-form journalism, and but he was afforded the space to explore that, and then the time afterwards to really investigate it. I don't think there are those sort of spaces in the UK, in terms of media outlets, and I think that's hugely important to modern American non-fiction writing. And I think there's an example on your long list last year, Caroline, which completely escapes me now, but that came from a similar sort of background. If I was being mischievous, I would say that the Americans can be hugely impressive and thorough and sonorous, and let's leave Didion aside, possibly on that, and Vidal, but that there is a mischief to some of the British writers, certainly just looking down this list. So Craig Brown's 2020 1, 2, 3, 4, that is a series of 100 sort of not quite impressionist essays, but semi-impressionist essays about the Beatles that sort of amount to and build into a portrait of them as a whole. And if you look back at Like a Fiery Elephant by Jonathan Coe, that's a similarly experimental and sort of freewheeling biography of Johnson that begins with a straight biography and ends with a series just of interviews, sort of paragraph-long extracts of interviews with people who knew him. So you could argue that there's something. Lucy Hughes Hallett's The Pike as well, which is an absolutely brilliant book about D'Annunzio. And that has, I think, the second chapter is just called Sightseeing, which is just a series of times when he, jumping around from one year to another and capturing D'Annunzio at various points in his life. Now, I'm sure American writers have done this sort of thing, but it doesn't feel, it feels possibly not an accident that those writers who have done it for the Baillie Gifford winners are all British.
Really interesting. So this prize is 25 years old, started in its first incarnation as the Samuel Johnson Prize, and now for some years the Baillie Gifford Prize. In that time, I mean, I think you've both probably read a fair few of the shortlisted books as well as the winning ones. Do you think that there is now a kind of greater focus on the literary quality as opposed to something new that they've brought us, and also, is it more inclusive now? I mean, I think last year, or was it last year, Caroline, that there were five out of the 6 on the shortlist were women writers?
They were very proud of that. Yes, because I think recent research by the Women's Prize showed that in terms of the coverage of women writing nonfiction, still lagging horribly behind coverage of nonfiction written by men. And I've seen this myself in bookshops. There's still this prevailing myth that nonfiction is more of a male thing. So in that context, I was very pleased with our shortlist, although I will point out that it emerged entirely organically. There was, didn't set out with that mission to make sure more women were recognized. But I read a tremendous amount of terrific nonfiction by women, and I know it's out there. So it's wonderful to have the chance to recognise it.
Do you think that the introduction now by the Women's Prize of a prize for nonfiction is going to, I don't know, let me ask you a much more open question. What do you think that'll do to, say, the Baillie Gifford?
It won't do anything to the Baillie Gifford. I mean, I feel that, nonfiction is such an expansive, territory that, the fact that there's another prize, I mean, hurrah. I don't think it needs to do anything to the Baillie Gifford. I mean, it'd be interesting, as it always is, to see which books different prize judges go for and different panels go for. And sometimes you see consensus, and quite often you see very different shortlists. As I said before, it is only a reflection of who was in the room judging at that particular time, but that's kind of wonderful. The more shortlisted, and let's not forget that shortlisted books are hugely important as well. The more shortlisted and winning books that we have, the better in a way. And if that's recognizing women writers of nonfiction, then that's an extremely good thing in my view.
Andrew, what do you think about the kind of greater focus on literary quality as well as the more inclusivity?
Yes, I think so. And it's noticeable that 2 out of the last 4 years have been won by women female writers. I Yes, I think if you look back to the beginning, so 1999 was Stalingrad by Anthony Beevor, 2000 was Berlioz by David Kearns, 2001 The Third Reich, A New History by Michael Burley. Those were awards honouring academic achievement as much as anything else, I suspect. I think there is much more interest in literary qualities, in originality as well. Now, I think there is a restlessness and I think this prize really charts that restlessness, and that sort of you could almost call it an impatience of the old standard forms. So if we get a book winning a biography that wins in the future, that begins with someone's great grandfather and ends with their death, I will be quite surprised. But um, I think it's originality and quality of writing, and which seem to me to be the things that both of subject and of execution that people and judges and the literary culture in general is focusing on.
Okay, that's really interesting. So the kind of conventionality of writing a biography receding. Do you think that there are other kinds of categories that are coming to the fore or going into the background? I mean, for example, the Baillie Gifford Prize has certainly highlighted how nature writing has changed. When you look, for example, at H by Helen MacDonald, I mean, that kind of was such an interesting hybrid, hard to categorise really as a book.
Oh, very hard to categorize as a book. I mean, that H is for Hawk has to be one of my favorite all-time winners. I have a very personal relationship with that book because I read it shortly after my own father had died, and I think yes, you put your finger on something very interesting, certainly for me, because I think a lot of my very favorite nonfiction books are a blend of things. They're a blend of genres. They're quite hard to categorize. And I think that's one of the things that has changed, in this drive for originality, some of the books that I read that I really love, I can't, and for the bookseller, I have to sort of put a category on it. And sometimes I really resist that because for me, the beauty is the fact that you can't quite do that. And I think this use of nature writing, memoir, that blend that Helen MacDonald achieved in that book has been enormously influential. I think the other thing, just going back to what Andrew was characterizing when he was talking about the kind of cradle to grave biography, I think it's also a function of, I don't believe you can judge a book by how long it looks. Sometimes big fat books you can absolutely rip through. Shorter books can be, difficult to read. However, I do think there is something about people being, there's a lot of demands on people's time, more and more and more so, maybe in the 25 years that this prize has been in existence. So you have to really, really want to get to know a subject to read a real cradle to grave, every single detail biography. Some biographies of great figures are 3 volumes, and I really think, I mean, I like to feel that I bang the drum for the, average reader walking into an independent bookshop. And I just think, actually these biographies where it's so interesting, where you get these wonderful biographies, which they don't try and tell you every single thing that happened and the whole story. They'll pick a time in that subject's life, or they'll pick a particular incident that was, as Andrew alluded to with the pike, that's not, you learn an awful lot about D'Annunzio, but it's the way in which it's told, the telling, the storytelling is really important. And this is really what we mean by narrative nonfiction. And this is why the two terms fiction and nonfiction are so unhelpful. Because for me, a book like Ages for Hawk or Super Infinites, they do everything for you that a novel can do. And they're very close together,
That's a really interesting observation, Andrew. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, yes, absolutely. And I think one other thing that has happened is the rise of the memoir and the rise of me, in a digital age where everyone is presenting themselves on digital media all the time. and you talk, it's become very prevalent. And if publishers are always saying, I've talked to lots of authors where they've had been writing a book, and the publisher has come back to them saying, put more of yourself in, put more of yourself in. And that's happened, even with the Rundle. She's in there a lot. It's about John Donne, but it's also partly about her. And Craig Brown, he inserts himself in there as well in his conversation about the Beatles. So I think memoir remains. It's sort of about last 5 years, Caroline, but it remains hugely influential and dominant.
Well, it does, but I feel myself, and it's interesting actually that really there are very, very few of our Baillie Gifford winners where you could call it, you could call it a memoir. I mean, H is for Hawke is an outstanding example. I feel myself, I read a huge amount of memoir, and I do feel myself slightly reacting against it. And that's not to say that I don't love memoir, because I do, but I feel like now, because the world is the way it is, and because one of the reasons why nonfiction is so important, it's because it's a way of contextualizing the world, understanding other people's lives, and so we get this perspective on the world, like Sally Hayden's My Fourth Time We Drowned that we shortlisted for the 2022 prize. These things are tremendously important. So a memoir that does not somehow illuminate a wider canvas, I feel that I am less interested in generally, although that's not to say that an extraordinary memoir couldn't shine through, but on the whole, I feel like when you're judging certainly the whole scope of nonfiction, a memoir has to work really quite hard to be up there with books like, I don't know, East West Street, which is an extraordinary synthesis of history and personal history and memoir, and it's these blends, that are so many things at once, and they are, in my view, the hardest books to write. But when they're done brilliantly, I mean, they stand out for miles for me.
Yeah, they really do. Philippe Sands is who you were referring to, with East West Street. So Caroline, you already have preempted my final question, which was really to get you to choose a book that you really love over the 25 years that has won. So for you, is it definitely Helen Macdonald's book, H is for Hawke?
Oh, must I just pick one? Well,
that's so funny. I'm always remembering that. I don't think I'll ever forget it, when Nick Hornby was on Desert Island Discs and with Sue Lawley presenting, and she asked him what his luxury would be, and he said an iPod, which is just so brilliant.
Yes, quite so. Yes, H is for Hawke. And East West Street by Philippe Sands, as I've mentioned. I was lucky enough to read that book very early on, so I feel I was so thrilled when both of those books won, because they're books that I'd loved from months before, And I just wanted to say also, there were plenty of books on the list of winners that I haven't read and that I need to, including the Craig Brown. I guess I'd like to mention The Five by Hallie Rubenhold as well. Extraordinary book, and again, very, very influential in terms of forgotten female history, and just the voices we don't hear from, the stories that are not told. And you could talk about the Sally Hayden in that respect, but yes, The Five.
I also loved Philip Hoare's Leviathan, which was a really interesting and original mix of, his own obsession with the ocean and swimming, and obviously the whale and Melville. I thought that was a pretty stellar book. Andrew, what about you?
Well, God, again, I haven't read every single one of them, but it's terrible, isn't it, to pick the one you were chair of judges for? And I will be rooting for the Patrick Radden Keith for the best of the 25 years. And if they don't win it, then frankly, they don't know what they're doing. But no, I would. Oh God! Do you know what? The one we haven't mentioned, 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare by James Shapiro. That was such to write about Shakespeare well, and to write accessibly is so difficult, and it's such a brilliant book. It's so eye-opening and it's partly about them moving across the Thames and taking all the planks with them to create a new theatre, the Globe. It's just it's astonishing book. I absolutely love that, and I love the Craig Brown as well. It was so funny and so original. But I'd go for the Shapiro.
Lovely. Thank you both, Andrew Holgate and Caroline Sanderson. Thank you so much for joining us. We'd also like to thank the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its generous support of this podcast. Now, to find out more about the Baillie Gifford Prize, you can visit the website or follow us on Twitter, if that's the kind of thing that you do, at BG Prize. If this episode has piqued your interest in the history of the prize, then you can find a 30-minute documentary on our website too. I'll see you next episode, when some of the judges will be gathering to discuss the shortlist for the 25th anniversary winner of winners, which Andrew has just been mentioning, which aims to pick the best of the prize's previous recipients. The award will be announced on the 27th of April at an event held at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. Till the next time. Bye-bye.
Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction podcast. This podcast is generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.